Okay, so it's now 11 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm Greg Saltzman. This is session 13.1 of the Labor and Employment Relations Association conference on what should unions do, what can unions do. And we have four papers today. I'm Greg Saltzman. I'm a professor of economics and management at Albion College. I also teach at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And I'll introduce our four speakers, and then we'll have the four paper presentations, and then we'll have some time for questions after all four papers have been presented. So our first paper is co-authored by Maxim Massenkoff and Nathan Wilmers, and it's the effect of strikes in an era of weak unions. Maxim just graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, with a PhD in economics. And in the fall, he's joining the faculty at the Naval Postgraduate School. And Maxim focuses on applied questions in labor economics and behavioral economics. His co-author is Nathan Wilmers, who is an assistant professor of work and organization at MIT's Sloan School of Management, researching wage and earnings inequality, economic sociology, and the sociology of labor. So in keeping with the spirits of LERA, this is an interdisciplinary paper with an economist and a sociologist working together. Our second paper is by Silvia. The UAW attempts to organize Volkswagen Chattanooga. Steve is professor of international relations at American University in Washington, D.C., where he's also an affiliate professor of economics. Steve's research is on comparative employment relations with a focus on Germany, the European Union, and the U.S. Our third paper is by Xiupeng Wang, Who Do Unions Protect from Job Losses? A Cross Comparison. Xiupeng is a postdoc associate at the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. His primary research interest is labor economics, and with a focus on labor market dynamics, labor market institutions, and immigration. His research also extends to industrial organization and economics of digitalization. And he's looking at how information technology affects organizational structure and size. Our final paper is by Greg Lyon, From Ludlow to Las Vegas, Citizenship, Work, and Attitudes Towards Labor Policy. And Greg received his PhD last year from Rutgers University and currently is a postdoctoral fellow at Tufts University, where he studies work, politics, and policy. So let me turn over the floor to Maxim and perhaps Nathan talking about their paper, The Effects of Strikes in an Era of Weak Unions.
All right, I'm sharing my screen. Okay, is that working for everyone? Great. So thanks everyone for coming. This is joint work with Nathan Wilmers, and it's also in its early stages, so we're really excited to get any feedback or questions you might have. So this is on the effects of strikes in an era of weak unions, and I'll be watching my time since we're doing pretty quick talks today. We begin with the stylized fact that strikes have declined substantially since the 1980s. So this is showing you that from 4 different series from the BLS, which contains large strikes, those with over 1,000 workers, strikes reported by the FMCS, and then 2 worker level data sets. So the 2 CPS surveys where workers are asked if they've recently been on strike. And so all of these are showing this pretty enormous decline. The frequency of strikes has fallen by an order of magnitude. And this decline has been faster than the fall in union membership. And so we see in the literature 2 kind of broad explanations for why this might be. One is that there was kind of a shift in the 80s that made the widespread use of strike replacements more normalized, including like the rise of temp agencies, and this made strikes ineffective. There's also theories about principal agent problems between union members and the union leadership. So strikes may still work for gaining worker bargaining leverage, but union leaders pass up on this opportunity because of differing incentives. So in this paper, we're going to do several new analyses on what strikes do. So first, at the firm level, we're going to combine strike information with Dun & Bradstreet data, which is supposed to be a census of all businesses in the US, and collective bargaining agreements collected by BNA, which is now Bloomberg BNA. And we're also going to use understudied labor dispute questions from the CPS and SIP in order to look at the impact of strikes on worker level outcomes. And so a quick high level summary is that strikes are still potent, but not because of increased wages and possibly due to lost business. So I'll start by telling you about the firm level analysis. In this section, we're going to combine information on about 13,000 strikes from the FMCS and the BLS with Dun & Bradstreet data on business performance. So in particular, we're performing this match to look at what happens to sales and employment at an establishment after a strike occurs. So this requires a pretty large fuzzy match. So for each strike, we're going to the Dun & Bradstreet data and saying in that state and year, can we find an identical or very close business name in the same city. And this matches about 3,000 to 4,000 strikes. And here I'm just showing you some descriptives. So this is starting from the 13,000 strikes that we have in our strike data and splitting by those that we were able to find a Dun & Bradstreet match for and those that we weren't. And this gives you, a sense of descriptives on the strikes overall too. And you can see that across these 2 samples, things are pretty similar, although there's it looks as though the non-matched strikes have a slightly larger number of idle workers, although I'm not reporting p-values here, so we're not doing any formal tests on this. So now that we've matched matched a few thousand Dun & Bradstreet establishments with the year of a strike, we're going to perform an event study, which follows a pretty standard specification. So here with the log of sales or employment on the left-hand side, we're going to regress that on establishment fixed effects, the standard event time indicators denoted by delta K, time varying controls, year fixed effects, and then standard errors clustered at the establishment level. And so here in the next plot, I'm going to just show you these delta Ks and their confidence intervals to try and understand what happens in the years before and following a strike to the log of sales. So what we're seeing here is that there's a decline in sales that begins in year 0 and kind of which is the year of the strike, and then continues on and levels off around 2 or 3 years after, with at a 5 to 10% decrease. And we see a pretty similar effect on employment. So here I'm just switching the outcome to the log of employees at that location as reported in the Dun & Bradstreet data. And there's a similar sharp decline beginning the year after the strike. So these are pretty strong effects and are somewhat comparable to what you'd see in studies of equities that are from an older literature. But they're, I think, about twice as large. But I want to say that the Dun & Bradstreet work, because the merge is very difficult. This is preliminary, and so these are results that we're still working on and doing some checks on. So next, we're going to turn to our other sources of data to ask what the mechanism is here. So one potential is that a strike results in a more generous wage settlement, and then this makes the business less competitive. But here I'm showing you kind of a summary result, which is just kind of the descriptive fact that when we look at collective bargaining agreements that are and are not associated with the strike, we don't see any systematic differences in the percent raises that the workers get over the subsequent years. So this is just showing you the average percent raise each year, splitting by contracts that we were and were not able to match to a strike. So this is a result without any control. It's just kind of showing you the raw data, but it's one that's robust to kind of any way we can cut the collective bargaining agreements information. So we can include fixed effects at the country level, and then like tighter industry state by year fixed effects. And we can also vary the window of strike inclusions. So whether we label a contract as affected by a strike is a judgment call, because if the strike happened a year before the collective bargaining agreement, you might think that was a little bit too distanced from the actual agreement. But it doesn't matter where we set that window. So this plot stays the same. And then finally, what we won't have time for today is that when we look in the CPS and SIP at person level data, we also don't see that workers following a dispute have higher wages. So next we return to the Dun & Bradstreet to study a kind of business theft mechanism, which has long been theorized, but there's only so far been evidence for it, I think, in the airline industry. So when one airline is affected by a strike, there's an increase in business at another airline. So here we're taking that same idea to the Dun & Bradstreet data. So if you're a business in a certain city, in a certain industry, and one of your competitors experiences a strike, what happens to your sales? And here we're finding that in the year of and immediately following the strike, there's a large increase in sales at competitors. So this gives evidence for a different potential mechanism separate from wages, which is that these firms are losing businesses to competitors following strikes. And that's the presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Maxim. So our second paper is by Silvia, the UAW attempts to organize Volkswagen Chattanooga.
Sure, thanks a lot, Greg. So I've been working a while. Let me go back. I gotta hold it. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so I've been working for some time looking at the cases in recent years where the UAW has been trying to organize foreign transplants in the southern United States. And this paper is focusing on one particular instance at one company, and that's at Volkswagen. Now, to give a little context on that when one looks at Volkswagen, one sees that that Volkswagen, that there's actually been 3 recognition elections at Volkswagen since 2014. There was the first one in 2014, then there was a second election of a micro unit of skilled mechanics that took place in 2015. And it's worth noting that the UAW won that recognition election, and the topic of the paper is focusing on the 2019 recognition election. But to understand that one, you really have to understand the other 2 as well. So why did Volkswagen launch this or why did the UAW launch this campaign to organize at Volkswagen Chattanooga in 2019? There's 3 reasons that I mentioned. One is just the conditions in the plant were problematic. They'd be familiar to anybody who's looked at an organizing drive on the kind of problems it would make a place a likely candidate for a recognition election. A second very important thing that happened in the end of 2018 is there was a brief walkout when management tried to change the ability for employees to use personal time, try to limit the times of the year they could do it, and they just did it through an announcement in the plant newspaper, and it led to a spontaneous walkout that lasted a couple hours. And then the final reason, which is also significant, is the UAW's effort to try to get Volkswagen to bargain with the skilled mechanics unit that voted in favor of the UAW really came to an end right around 2018, 2019. So one of the things that's very interesting about looking at this case is the UAW really went to great lengths to try to do things differently in 2019, that there are a number of lessons that they took from the 2014 drive and really tried to do things differently. One was the whole strategy was to have a surprise, quick election to try to catch Volkswagen management off guard. This strategy didn't work, and I'll talk a little bit about why it didn't work later. Second thing is, compared to 2014, when Volkswagen, when the UAW did bargaining to organize and really tried to work with Volkswagen management to get card check and they negotiated a neutrality agreement in 2014. They decided they were going to do none of that, that they were instead going to focus on local issues and these problems that I mentioned. And they also recognized that they would be doing a recognition election, which is a contrast to 2014, where they really desperately tried but failed to get card check. Another thing which was prominent in both these 2014 and 2019 recognition election drives was outside interference. The Tennessee political establishment came in as hard as and as heavy in 2019 as they did in 2014. But a big difference was that the UAW decided that it really wasn't going to use international connections to try to advance its case. That was partly because of the surprise strategy and the idea of going quickly, that the initial strategy was not to involve international actors, even the German ones. When the organizing drive got stretched out, they did in the end get some support, but it really wasn't all that important. I think it's also important to mention that in the 2019 drive, that the UAW corruption scandal certainly was an issue that weighed on the campaign. Now, when we look at management side, when we look at Volkswagen, Volkswagen was not static throughout this, and it's important to see how Volkswagen management evolved. That in 2014, Volkswagen management took a neutral stance. They were definitely favorably disposed toward unionization. It would have solved an issue for management that the works councils, the existing works council network in Volkswagen, definitely wanted a works council in Chattanooga, and Volkswagen management was willing to go along with that. And as many of you know, U.S. labor law requires unionization in order to build something like a works council. So although Volkswagen management was never all that thrilled about unionization, they were willing to go along with it. They had a problem that they had agreed early on when they were negotiating, initially coming in, that they weren't going to be union. And this led to an issue of Volkswagen management trying to balance, on the one hand, the Tennessee establishment, which did not want a union at all, and the Works Council, which very much wanted a Works Council. They were hoping to be able to split the difference and just have a Works Council, but when they first did the investment, they weren't aware of DuPont and Electromation and American labor law, which made it impossible to get one without the other. Now, Volkswagen management really began on a road of transformation in its attitude toward unions in 2015 when the UAW organized this micro unit. And they had an election and they won the election by a rather high margin, over 70%. Volkswagen management, as I said, they never were all that thrilled about getting a union, but they did want a works council. This micro unit of 160 employees was never going to get them a works council. And it was at that point that Volkswagen management decided to fight the micro unit and fight the whole idea of a micro unit and whether it was permissible in US labor law. That led them to contract with Littler Mendelson, and they have been working with Littler Mendelson, which is one of the more prominent union avoidance firms in the United States. And so Volkswagen management worked with them ever since. And by the time you get to 2019, you get this transformation of Volkswagen from ambivalently allowing a union to following a standard anti-union playbook. So last slide, when you look at it, just quickly, that there was, things went wrong for the UAW in this case. I would point to two big things, which were miscalculations on the part of the UAW. One was a tactical error, and that is they had this idea of doing a quick recognition election. However, they never quite cleaned up the legal cases that were still in place from the skilled mechanics legal dispute. So there was still, they still were fighting that case, and there still were unfair labor practices. And early on, they tried to disclaim the unit, which is to have no, to say legally they weren't interested in representing it anymore. But there were still some unfair labor practice cases that were around, and Littler Mendelson took great advantage of that, working with the NLRB, with new appointees from Donald Trump, and managed to take what the UAW hoped to be a 4-week campaign and stretch it into a 9-week campaign. The other strategic error, or the bigger strategic error that I would say that they did, and would have been hard to have seen this except in retrospect, and it is the decision that the UAW made to try to pursue a micro unit, because it was that decision that led Volkswagen management to engage with Littler Mendelson, and it's really facilitated the transition of Volkswagen from being ambivalently supportive of the UAW to carrying out an aggressive anti-union campaign in 2019. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So our next paper is by Xiupeng Wang. Who do unions protect from job losses? A cross-national comparison.
Thanks. Let me share my screen. Here we go. You see that?
Yes.
All right. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm very happy to be in this session to present my paper about union wage structure and involuntary job loss. It's a cross-national comparison using longitudinal data from 4 countries. And here is the structure of my presentation. I'm going to start with the introduction of the background and the literature. So in general, it's been believed that unionization plays an important role in shaping the wage structure. And there also is massive literature providing data and evidence shows that workers in union sector appear to earn more than those workers in non-union sectors. And there's also evidence saying that the wage distribution in union sector is narrower compared to the non-union sector. So basically it's saying that in general, union will raise the wage of the workers, especially for the lower skilled workers, and also reduce the gap among the workers with different skill levels. But there are also different voices saying that, no, unions, the wage structure in the union sector is just purely reflecting the distribution of the skill of these workers. It's just a pure selection. So I'm going to join this debate in this paper to look at this through the angle of job displacement. And I'm going to talk about the two-sided selection model from David Carr's paper in 1996, which this model introduced the selection into the unionization in the union sector is a different level of skills are bounded differently. This paper uses data from 4 countries, that from UK, Switzerland, Germany, and Korea. So this multinational comparison framework provides me an advantage in examining how the labor market institutions, especially unionization in different countries that shape the wage structure and alter the patterns of involuntary job loss. Among these 4 countries, Germany stands out as that has the strongest institutional labor market institution. Its union bargains at the national and the regional level and set the collective agreements to cover the entire industry, that including all the workers in this industry, no matter, regardless if this worker is a union member or not. So here's a model from the card. It's just a brief summary of that. So suppose a worker has a productivity of GI, and this person's non-union wage is now given as WIN equals to GI plus a error term. So the expected non-union wage is GI. And her union wage, WIU, equals to theta 0 plus theta 1 times GI plus an error term. And here theta 0 is a positive number, suggesting that in general union raise the wage for the workers, especially for lower skilled workers. And theta 1 is between 1 and 0, suggesting that the return to skill in union sector is a bit lower than the non-union sector. And there are 2 binding conditions. One is from the higher end, for the high ability workers, their union wage premium should exceed the disutility of the union job, which is rho I here. So basically saying that this wage premium should be high enough to offset the disutility for high skilled workers. And the lower end, the firm specific match component WI for lower ability workers should exceed her union wage premium, basically saying that in order to have a firm to hire this person and pay this person a union wage, the output of this person should be high enough. Therefore, the range of the worker's ability, GI, is given by this inequality here. All right. So let me show you what's the prediction on the job displacement. So the firm's net profit of hiring a union worker now is given by this term, that is the output, the GI plus WI minus the union wage, and can be plotted initially can be plotted from by this plot. And the so the workers in the union are in this range from GI lower bar to GI higher bar. Initially, the net profit of hiring workers in this range, the profit for the firms, net profit for this firm is ranging from 0 to WI minus rho I. Now, if there's a negative shock on the product of this firm, and this curve will shift downward. Therefore, for workers at the lower end, unions, the firms hiring workers at the lower tail, there's not as profitable as before. So firms will let these workers go. And for high skilled workers in union sector, although their the profit of hiring them is lower than before, but still remain positive. So that means that these workers are less likely to lose their jobs. So there's a key in here to how to estimate the workers' skill levels. So I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to use the wage estimation in the fixed effect model, where the log W is the log wage, and the key part is the individual fixed effect lambda I here, controlling the XI, which is the demographic characteristics, HI is the human capital indicators, and J is the job characteristics. And I also have the year fixed effect in there. So traditionally, the observed skills are like education or tenures. Those are the ones in the data that can be observed by economists and other people who deal with the data. And there are also dimensions of the workers' skill levels. They cannot be observed by from the data, but they can be observed by the supervisor and the employers. And those can also be reflected in the wage. Therefore, in this model, the individual fixed effect will capture that. So I'll use that as the proxy of this person's unobserved skills. In the second step, I will use the estimated individual fixed effect lambda I hat as the regressor on the right-hand side in this linear probability model, where DI is a binary variable that equals to 1 if this worker loses jobs eventually. So this rho I is the coefficient of interest that captures the correlation of the worker's ability level and the probability of job loss.
Excuse me, I see you're only less than halfway through your presentation. You're going to have to speed up.
Sure, okay. And some of the slides are just appendix, not
okay.
So yeah, to speed up a little bit, I'm use the data from these 4 countries: Britain, Germany, Korea, and Sweden. Those data are BHPS, SOEP, CLIPS, and SHP. I'm gonna skip this part, and in this data, I only cover the prime age workers. And these person who lose a job should stay in the firm with the same employer for at least 3 years. So it's different from the paper of the Lemons, from Cass and the Gibbons. So these workers, their employer are happy with these workers for at least 3 years until at some certain point that they let these workers go. I only include the positive workers, workers with positive level earnings and the full-time jobs. Here is the result from the first step. As for the time, because of time, let me just focus on the last column, column 6. That's from the fixed effect model. That controls all the possible covariance and fixed effects that have the year fixed effect, human capital indicators, industry, occupation, and industry by occupation. And it also shows that the wage is positively correlated with age, negatively correlated with age squared. It's just a means regression and nothing really surprising here. The purpose of doing this is just to get the estimated individual fixed effect. Now I can plot this individual fixed effect into this graph here. So this is for Britain. It shows that the red solid line here shows a narrow distribution in union sector than the non-union sector. So suggesting the wage structure in union sector is narrower than the non-union sector. Similarly, for Korea and Switzerland, they also have a narrow distribution in union sector than non-union sector, and also the average wage in union sector is also higher than the non-union sector. And the one that's a little bit different than the other countries, that's Germany, shows that the distribution of the union wage is very similar as the non-union wage, suggesting, which is consistent with the my introduction about the unique institutional setting in Germany. So how does that affect the job loss? So also I'm going to focusing on the last column. That in the individual fixed effect is negatively correlated with possibility of job loss in all 4 countries. So suggesting the lower ability workers in these 4 countries are more likely to lose jobs, and the higher ability workers are more likely to keep their jobs. But if I break down into 2 sectors, this striking result shows here. So in countries of Britain, Korea, and Switzerland, these 3 countries, such coefficient I showed you in the previous slides is almost completely contributed by the union sector, where in union that lower ability workers in union are more likely to lose the jobs, while higher ability workers in union are more protected. Where in this is non-union sector shows no statistical significant result here, suggesting in the competitive labor market that more productive worker, they are more productive and they are more expensive than other workers. Therefore, when the firm wants to decide who to lay off, they probably face a really similar probability of losing their jobs. And the only country that's different is here, the Germany, that shows very similar patterns in both union and non-union sectors, which also consistent with this unique institutional setting in Germany, that with the collective bargaining and the contract extended to both union members and non-union members. So to conclude that, so I use the estimated individual fixed effect as a proxy of the workers' unobserved skills. And in general, lower paid workers are more likely to lose jobs. But this is mainly contributed by the union sectors. And the union reduces the wage gap between high-skilled and low-skilled workers. For low-skilled workers in union sector, they receive a higher wage premium in exchange of lower job security. So they're more likely to lose jobs. And high-skilled union workers are more secure with their jobs with a compromise of lower wage premium. And that's all my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So our final paper is by Greg Lyon from Ludlow to Las Vegas: Citizenship, Work, and Attitudes Towards Labor Policy.
Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, so this is entitled From Ludlow to Las Vegas, Citizenship, Work, and Attitudes Toward Labor Policy. The title changed here and there, so it might be different from the program. As many who study work and politics, policy, and history probably know, there's a long history of immigration and work in the United States, and that's the reference to Ludlow, as the Ludlow miners, the Greek and Italian immigrants in the kind of battles in Colorado in the early 1900s, and then all the way up to today. There's been, citizenship has been an important part of work and kind of the treatment workers have at work. On the other hand, labor policy, we know shapes and molds working conditions, worker treatment. We also know from political science research that policy tends to reflect opinion, albeit over time. In the United States, Latino non-citizens, we know are subject to high levels of exploitation, low wages, precarious work. And we also know they're overrepresented in work with poor working conditions. On the other hand, the labor policy element of it is somewhat missing, at least systematic research on views of labor policy. A lot of research that's focused on Latinos and non-citizens has focused on kind of government spending and understandably immigration policy. But there's really little work on how Latino non-citizens view labor policy. We know that unions are associated with a number of empirical changes in the workplace, greater control over work processes or schedules, better working conditions, lower levels of economic inequality, political inequality. And so the expectation today that I have is that we might then expect that Latino non-citizens, given high levels of exposure to poor working conditions, high levels of exploitation, may have high support for policy that would make it easier to form unions or ease the unionization process, a core part of labor policy. But the support may come because of exclusion, history of antagonism between unions and non-citizen workers. And so if these views of policy reflect support for unions, then we should see positive views of unions and support for easing unionization processes among Latino non-citizens. To examine this question, I'm going to use National Annenberg Election Study from 2004, University of Pennsylvania. The one obvious drawback here is that, of course, much has changed since 2004. But one benefit is the large sample size allows for subgroup analysis, includes indicators of citizenship, was conducted in both English and Spanish, and has key labor policy items that are rarely asked in large-scale surveys such as this. And what I'm going to do is simply look at the dependent variables. Here are two attitudes about labor policy. One is, do you support making it easier for workers to form labor unions? And two, how favorable do you feel toward labor unions, from very unfavorable to very favorable? The key independent variables or predictors of interest are whether the respondents identify as Latino and whether they identify as non-citizens. Include a number of controls, a range of demographic information, gender, race, age, income, education, union household, ideology, employment status, state fixed effects, as well as occupation fixed effects. And what we're really interested in is the interaction between the two predictors, Latino, non-citizen. And so we have that included in the model. And we have two models. One is a logit model. The second is an OLS model. And here are the results from the first model. I'm not showing the whole table. I'm just showing the predicted probabilities with all those other variables held constant at their median values. And what we see in the gray are non-Latinos, in the black Latino, and then separated by both citizen and non-citizen. And this is the predicted probability that they support, making it easier to unionize. And as we see, non-citizen Latinos are extremely very supportive of such a policy, approaching a predicted probability of 9, and much higher than both citizens as well as non-Latinos. Difference of about roughly 20%, 20 points. Second, the second analysis looks at favorability toward unions. This is again on a 10-point scale, 0 to 10, 10 being the highest, the most favorable views. And here we see it's not just that there's support for making it easier to unionize, because one might say that because unions have a history of exclusion, that they want to make it easier, but they don't necessarily feel positive toward unions. But here, suggests that Latino non-citizens also feel quite positively toward unions overall, approaching about 6.8 on a scale of 0 to 10, with 5 being neutral and 10 being the most positive. So this offers support for both expectations. And here, really the implications are, first, Latino non-citizens are highly supportive of easing the process of unionization, and have very positive views of unions. And I argue this stems from experience in the workplace, high levels of exploitation, and poor working conditions. This builds on research in public opinion, which is experience-driven policy attitudes. Exposure to something may shape how you see the desirability of an institution or a policy itself. Third, this also speaks to research on co-enforcement labor standards. Research by Janice Fine has shown that unions, worker centers, legal aid clinics, and others provide kind of lateral enforcement alongside the state in the workplace. This is premised on work organizations having a greater trust among vulnerable low-wage workers. And here I've shown, I don't have data on views of worker centers or other institutions, but at least as respect to unions, we do see that there's evidence that Latino non-citizens who are vulnerable workers have quite positive views of unions and likely other institutions that play a role in co-enforcement. There are some limitations here, of course. This is a selection effect. Non-citizens are in the US through non-random processes, so it's difficult to overcome. As well as more recent data might be helpful to update findings. This is from 2004. And of course, as we know, much has changed since then. But there's a lack of large scale surveys with all these components in there. So I'm certainly open to suggestions if you know of some. that ask about labor policy items as well. But in conclusion, I think that immigration and labor policy should increasingly be considered in tandem. I know this is not uncommon to many, but a path to citizenship and a path to unionization may actually have broad appeal. And I think we've seen this also in the recent 2020 Democratic primary, where some candidates explicitly integrated immigration policy, worker exploitation, and labor policies and standards in their policy plans in ways that maybe wasn't as common before. And I think that coalitions that span this labor immigration policy area may actually be effective in materializing change. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I'll make some comments and present some questions that have already been put in the chat by members of the audience. If you have additional questions, please type them in the chat. So for Maxim and Nathan, I guess I was impressed by how many different data sources they mined and pulled together for this. Benjamin Kreider had a few questions, some of which have already been answered in the chat, and he asked if Nathan and Maxim could elaborate on lessons learned.
Yes.
Well, let me just go through all of these, and then and you can think about your answer while I'm going through all of these. Okay, then for Steve and Silvia, I guess a question I had was, in the 70s, Irv Bluestone, as the UAW vice president for GM, was acting swiftly when GM was trying to implement their Southern strategy of opening Southern plants on a non-union basis. And Bluestone basically said, you're going to have trouble in your already unionized plants in the North unless you accept UAW representation in the South. And since Bluestone acted fast, GM didn't have enough non-union Southern plants to say, well, I'll just make the jump. And I guess my question, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but EJ Metall, the German metal workers union, obviously had a lot of power over Volkswagen's plants in Germany. And why couldn't they have sort of used the Irv Bluestone strategy of the 1970s of saying, okay, you're going to have trouble in Wolfsburg if you don't accept UAW representation in Chattanooga, so that you know, they could have used that as a lever to maintain VW neutrality like they had in the first campaign. Then for Xiupeng, I guess my biggest question when I looked at your paper, you didn't seem to distinguish between layoffs and dismissals for cause. More layoffs than dismissals for cause, but these seem to be fundamentally different. And so the union role is not the same for dismissals for cause as it is for layoffs. Then for Greg Lyon, I realized non-citizen Latinos having pro-union attitudes would be very helpful in a union organizing campaign. What use would it be, however, in, say, influencing US election outcomes? Like Biden seems to have a very strongly pro-union platform, even talking about reversing an old NLRB decision banning intermittent strikes. And but if you're a non-citizen, by definition, you cannot vote in U.S. elections. So what difference does that make? And Nathan had a question for Greg Lyon also. Is it possible that non-citizens come from a country with left-wing labor and political movements, so it's not just the experience of exploitive labor conditions in the U.S., although that may be part of it, but they had pre-existing pro-union positions because they were radicalized in their home countries. Then Janice Fine also had something for Greg, saying that I guess foreign-born Latinx people arrive with anti-union feelings to their experiences, impressions of unions in their home country. So it's their experiences here over time that maybe will shift this. So why don't we go through in order with Maxim, Nathan, then Stephen, and then Xiupeng, then Greg responding to these questions. And I'll look at the chat to see what other questions people have added.
All right, so I'll start with we just got 2 messages in the chat about pre-trends in sales leading up to the strike. So just to answer those really quickly, we didn't see any kind of conventionally significant evidence of that. It does seem like going from like a year before to the year of the strike, or 2 years before to a year before the strike, sales might have been slightly higher, but there's kind of nothing consistent across specifications. So if you just wanted to fit like a linear term to those pre-trend coefficients, you wouldn't really find anything. But that's something that we're still digging into and very curious about. On the kind of lessons learned, we kind of emphasize the kind of conservative takeaway that something happened in the 1980s to make strikes a lot less frequent. And so our evidence from a more recent set of strikes is that it's not the case that temp agency and replacement hires have totally incapacitated or disempowered strikes. And yeah, so there's a few things that we can say to that. Like these aren't because of big corporations shifting businesses across locations, because we see the exact same results when we restrict to establishments that only have a single location. But yeah, we're still working on that aspect of it too. And yeah, Nate, feel free to add anything.
Yeah, just briefly on that broader point, I mean, this is something we'd love to get people's feedback on, but we were sort of surprised by both our main results. We sort of expected either strikes wouldn't matter at all for revenue and employment, and also wouldn't matter for wages because they're just ineffectual now. Or we expected that if there were negative effects on a business, it would be because of the more generous wage settlement that came from a strike. And we really didn't find evidence for either of those 2 standard stories. And so I think, from the perspective of the labor movement, there's some good news here in that strikes still seem to be effective at imposing costs on businesses, which means that the strike threat is still credible. But on the other hand, there's a real challenge in that it doesn't seem as though the workers who are actually going on strike and therefore maintaining that threat, bigger picture, it doesn't seem as though they're necessarily being rewarded by higher wages for going on that strike. So to me, I see that as sort of the 2 sides, kind of some good news for unions, and on the other hand, a real challenge of how do you deal with getting strikes to happen if there's really intransigent employers who are still going to be unwilling to give a wage settlement in response to it.
One final point was that, which we also got asked about, is that all of these results were just applying to private sector strikes, because there's not kind of an obvious revenue concept that we could pin down in Dun & Bradstreet for something like a school. So we would love to dig into the kind of public sector strikes, which we've been seeing more of recently. And perhaps we might have enough power to do that in the collective bargaining agreements analysis.
Okay, Steve, do you want to respond?
Sure. It's an interesting question. And if you go beyond the paper, you can see instances where either IG Metall or the Works Council did apply pressure. The first Volkswagen plant in the US in Westmoreland, Pennsylvania, in that case, there was only UAW plants in the US at that point because there weren't even any transplants. The VW plant in Westmoreland was the first. And it was very clear that the IG Metall did lean on management to do card check, and they did do card check. But there's a couple of things that I would say beyond that on why the world is different now than it was then. One would be that the Works Council in Volkswagen had a very ambiguous position. Works councils tend to not want to become dependent on unions, and the Volkswagen Works Council initially, this is back in 2012 or so, they said, we definitely want a Works Council in Chattanooga. If there's a union, well, that's nice, but we definitely want a Works Council. Now, the thing that really you did get beginning in around the same time, 2012 or so, you really got a big interest from IG Metall to get involved, and that was when the transatlantic trade partnership was being discussed, and they suddenly became very worried about zero tariffs between the US and Europe, and that cars would start coming out of, they were worried about Daimler in Alabama. And IG Metall invested in millions of euros and several personnel into an effort to try to help the UAW, and had an elaborate campaign with shared mailings. The head of IG Metall had letters that went out to members in Chattanooga for the Chattanooga campaign. And so they really got involved. They got involved not so much with a threat in the way you were talking about with Irving Bluestone, but it was more spending money trying to show international solidarity. One last point on this to show the limits, and I think this case does show the limits of international trade union partnership, is the UAW worked through the Global Union Federation that they're a member of, which is Industrial, and it was ultimately a number of letters went out, and ultimately in January of 2019, Industrial suspended their global framework agreement with Volkswagen. And this is a fairly serious thing to do at the international level. However, it was not substantial enough for Volkswagen management to reverse its course. So we see, you know, this very fragile international trade union level. We see its limits in that this, which was in many ways the ultimate act that could be done, and they did it over the skilled mechanics unit of suspending the global framework agreement. It wasn't enough to sway Volkswagen management.
Thank you. Xiupeng?
Yeah. So to respond to your question, that you said you could not distinguish the layoff and dismissal of cause. In this data, those workers who are displaced for the reasons made redundant or mass layoff, plant closed down, dismissal, or sacked, I think because I use data from 4 countries, I need to be consistent among these 4 countries. When they code the reason to leave your previous employer, I think for some country, the data, I don't remember which one that's on the top of my head, that this dismissal or sack is coded with other reasons together. So I'm just not able to distinguish that. And also, I think also dismissal here, it's not really clear whether it's dismissal because of economic downturn or a bad performance. of this worker. So it just couldn't tell through the data. And in general, that I think in these countries, that dismissal is relatively rare than the other reasons who leave their previous employers. And but also please bear in mind that the workers who leave their jobs, they stay with their previous employer for at least 3 years. It's not like they just joined this firm and had a bad performance, got sacked, and to let it go in 2 or 3 months. So their employer are happy with their performance for at least 3 years. So yeah, that's the answer I can give for this question.
Okay, thanks. Greg Lyon?
Sure. So the few questions from Nate about the country of origin, I think is great. And Johnny's suggestion was also very helpful with the database of political institutions. That's something I'm, basically, does country of origin matter? You know, if there's if people come from a left-wing country or have a different history when they come to the United States. It's something I've looked into, and it's a work in progress. But the downside is the more I cut the data, the lower the N gets, and it becomes difficult to say get reliable results. But it's certainly something I'm keeping in mind. And I'm trying to remember the other, going through some of the comments. Yep, Asif on the mediating effects of worker centers, another great point, and something I'm trying to address, but with data limitations, it's difficult, but I think there's definitely an important role that worker centers play in the positive impressions, which can go both ways, which Janice pointed out too, Janice Fine, on how integrated unions and worker centers are, just like Ben Kreider's work on the relationship between worker centers and unions. We may see different attitudes. If there's a good working relationship, they organize marches and things together, or if there's more antagonism, we may see something a bit more of a divergence. So thank you very much.
Thanks. So we're running over a little bit. So this stream is going to be taken over by another group in 13 minutes. First, there were requests that all the PowerPoint slides be uploaded to the website so that people can see all of the slides. And I do want to raise a question that Janice Balache asked, that if there is a Democratic Congress in 2021 and labor law reform is on the agenda, she said it's essential that American unions confront the issue about works councils and figure out how to have works councils complement and coexist with unions. Steve, you've done work on Germany, and you've obviously done work on Volkswagen in Chattanooga with works councils. Do you have any thoughts about works councils coexisting with unions if American labor law is changed next year?
Yes, I think it would be a challenge. I saw that Tom Kochen was here at one point, and he would be quite familiar with the whole discussion because he was deeply involved with the Dunlop Commission back during the Clinton administration. The big challenge is works councils in Germany, they deal with the plant level. The unions do sectoral collective bargaining generally, and they're generally above the level of the plant, whereas our unions with our locals tend to be situated right in the plants. So trying to have works councils that wouldn't be used to undercut unions has always been the big challenge. And the other thing, earlier in the campaign, we had Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders talking about putting employees on corporate boards, which is the other piece of co-determination. And both these things are difficult to do in isolation because you do worry about employee capture by management. And I think if the Democrats do experiment in that area, they're going to have to be very careful to avoid that as an outcome.
Can I just say, add one thing? I agree with Steve, but I really want to say, when you have 6% unionization in the private sector, one has to think about how you get a voice, for another whole segment. I almost see it in the United States like being two-step. If you could get people into works councils and get them, in a sense, have a sense of worker, independent worker voice, elected, etc., and then get information and consultation on specific topics, such as like with management doesn't want to give you, downsizing, restructuring, etc., wage rates throughout the enterprise, and then move it up. I think you really have to see it. We don't have a German history, I agree, but when you're down to 6%, you have to think how to do it. When I first proposed this, which is right after electromation was written, one of my colleagues at Wharton said, Janice, it'll never go through because unions will be against it. They'll see it as a threat. And you know what? Management sees the foot in the door and they'll be against it too. So think about that point.
So I would agree with Janice that ultimately, if you look at it from the perspective of employees rather than the perspective of unions, that to give employees the voice which they desperately need and do not have in the United States, works councils would be an effective way to accomplish that end. Again, it's what Janice said, I think trying to get it through would be a challenge because of the implications on what it would mean for unions as they operate here and now in the US.
And companies, they won't want it.
Yeah. But that problem of lack of voice just cries out in the US, and the desire to come up with a solution, some means to give workers voice, I think is why people turn to works councils again and again.
Hey, Maxim, Xiupeng, and Greg Lyon, any last comments? Because we're running out of time here.
I'm good. Thank you.
Great session.
Okay, well, thank you. We have been recording this, so if you want to go back, you can see the recording. Okay.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.